The silence in the Dakota mountains was the kind that swallowed sound whole. It was 1879, and the world had gone white, buried under a snow so deep it felt permanent. A lone wagon, a ghost on the ridge, cut through the drifts, its wheels groaning like a dying man. Inside sat a woman. Her name was Arian Grace, and she was out of food, out of hope, and running out of time. Then she saw it. A thin curl of smoke, faint as a prayer, rising from the pines. It led her to a cabin, a small stubborn box of wood against the endless winter. The windows glowed gold. She didn't know if it was a trap or salvation, but at this point they were the same thing. She knocked, her knuckles numb against the rough wood. The door swung open, and a man filled the frame. He was built of oak and shadow, with eyes the color of a winter sky and a beard dusted with snow. He said nothing. He just looked at her, his gaze stripping away her thin shawl, her worn-out dress, her last shred of dignity. "I can cook," she said, the words tumbling out before her nerve could break. "And clean. I won't ask for pay. Just a place by the fire until the thaw." The wind howled behind her, pushing her forward. The man stepped aside. "Kitchen's that way." She stumbled inside, and the warmth hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was sparse, clean, and suffocatingly lonely. A fire smoldered in the hearth, a single chair sat beside it, but it wasn't the loneliness that made her blood run cold. It was the little girl. She was sitting on a cot in the corner, no older than 4, clutching a crude wooden doll. Her hair was blonde as summer wheat, but her eyes were wide with a kind of fear that didn't belong on a child's face. She stared at Arian, not with curiosity, but with the dead-still terror of a cornered animal. The man shut the door, plunging the room into dim light. "That's Annie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm George Whitlow." Arian tried to smile, kneeling down. "Hello, sweetheart." The girl, Annie, didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her tiny body was rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the doll. George pointed to the stove. "There's a stew there. See if you can bring it back to life." Arian got to work, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the ladle. But the familiar motions of a kitchen calmed her. She stoked the fire, stirred the pot, and soon the scent of salt and vegetables began to fill the small space. All the while, she could feel the little girl's eyes on her, watching, waiting. When the stew was ready, they sat at the small table. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Annie took a hesitant spoonful, then another. She glanced at Arian from under her lashes. "It's good," she whispered, the sound barely audible. Arian felt a crack in the ice around her heart. "Thank you, little one." It was the first kind word the cabin had heard in a long, long time. George ate in silence, his eyes darting between them. He watched the way Arian moved carefully, as if she expected a blow for any wrong step. He saw the caution in her eyes, the exhaustion etched into her bones. She never asked for a thing, never complained. And that, more than anything, made him uneasy. That night the snow started again, a thick, smothering blanket that sealed them in. George pulled a spare blanket from the loft. "You can sleep by the fire," he grunted. "Thank you," she whispered back. The fire crackled, the wind moaned outside. It was almost peaceful, until the little girl spoke. Her voice, a tiny, terrified whisper, cut through the quiet. "Daddy," Annie said, her eyes fixed on Arian, "are you going to hurt her too?" The spoon dropped from George's hand, clattering on the wooden floor. Arian's breath hitched in her throat. She looked from the grim-faced man to the terrified child, and the cozy cabin suddenly felt like a cage. The question hung in the air, heavy and poisoned. Hurt her too? George froze, his face a mask of stone. He knelt by his daughter, his voice rough with something Arian couldn't name. "No, honey, no one's getting hurt." Annie's lower lip trembled. "But Mama," she started, her voice breaking. George pulled her into a fierce hug, burying his face in her hair to silence her. The sound of the child's stifled sobs was the only thing louder than the storm outside. Arian turned away, pretending to busy herself with the fire, but the girl's words echoed in her mind. "Two, two, two." Later, after Annie had cried herself to sleep, George stood by the hearth, his face hidden in the shadows. "She gets confused," he muttered, not looking at Arian. "Doesn't remember things right. Her mother." She was sick for a long time. Arian didn't buy it. She'd seen the look in Annie's eyes. That wasn't confusion. That was memory. Children remember what they feel, she said softly, not just what they're told. He had no answer for that. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, filled with unspoken questions. Arian cooked and cleaned, her movements quiet and efficient. She patched worn clothes and hummed old lullabies under her breath. And slowly, miraculously, the little girl began to thaw. Annie would watch her, then inch closer. Soon, she was humming along, a tiny, reedy voice joining Arian's low, prayer-like tunes. George would be outside chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe keeping time with their songs. He could hear them through the chinks in the cabin walls, and the sound was like water on parched earth. It was a warmth he hadn't realized he was starving for, but it was a dangerous warmth, a warmth that could make a man soft, a warmth that could make him forget. One evening, he walked in to find them both asleep by the fire. Annie was curled up on a rug, her head in Arian's lap, the wooden doll tucked under her arm. Arian's head was leaned back against the stone hearth, her face peaceful in the flickering light. For the first time since she'd arrived, the fear was gone from her expression. He stood there for a long time, just watching them. The scene was so domestic, so right. It scared him more than any blizzard. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice startling them both awake. Arian's eyes flew open, a flicker of her old fear returning. "So should you," she replied, her voice husky with sleep. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Fair enough." But the moment was broken by a sudden gust of wind that rattled the cabin door, a reminder of the world outside. He turned away, his voice flat again. "I need supplies from town. I'll ride out in the morning." Arian just nodded, but he saw it, a shadow crossing her face, the familiar look of a woman who had been left behind one too many times. He told himself it didn't matter. He was just being practical. But as he lay in his loft that night, listening to the soft sound of her breathing by the fire below, he knew he was lying. He left at dawn. The cabin felt hollow without his presence, the silence returning. But this time, it was just empty. Arian threw herself into work, needing the rhythm of it to quiet her thoughts. She decided to bake bread. Her hands, clumsy at first, soon remembered the motions, the feel of the dough coming to life beneath her palms. It was a memory from another lifetime, a life that had held laughter and warmth and the smell of baking bread. Annie, captivated, pulled a stool over. She helped by poking her small fingers into the rising dough, giggling when it stuck to her nose. For a few hours, the cabin was filled with the scent of yeast and the sound of a child's laughter. For a few hours, Arian allowed herself to pretend this was her life, that this little girl was hers, that the man riding back through the snow was coming home to her. It was a foolish, dangerous dream. George returned at dusk, a shroud of snow on his shoulders. The cabin greeted him with a golden glow and the overwhelming aroma of fresh bread. The table was set. A hearty stew steamed in the center, a slab of butter melted on a warm loaf. It should have felt like coming home. It felt like a trap. In town, he'd gone to the mercantile for flour and salt. But he'd gotten more than he bargained for. Jonas Pike, a man whose tongue was sharper than his wits, had been holding court by the pot-bellied stove. "Heard you took in that widow, George," Pike had drawled, a nasty grin on his face. "Arian Grace. Pretty thing. Cursed, though. Husband dropped dead not 6 months after they wed. They say she's barren, too. The kind of woman that brings bad luck." The other men had chuckled. George had just stared them down, paid for his supplies, and walked out. But the words had followed him. clinging to him like the cold, cursed, bad luck. He looked at the perfect scene in his cabin, the warm light, the smiling woman, the happy child, and all he could hear was Pike's sneering voice. Arian saw the change in him the moment he stepped through the door. His face was a closed book, his eyes cold and distant. "You made it back," she said, her smile faltering. "Roads weren't bad," he grunted, avoiding her gaze. Supper was a torturous affair. The bread tasted like ash in his mouth. He spoke in monosyllables. Annie, sensing the shift, fell silent, her earlier chatter gone. The only sound was the crackle of the fire. That night, Arian couldn't sleep. She sat by the dying embers, watching the shadows dance on the walls. She knew that look in his eyes. She'd seen it before. It was the look of a man poisoned by other people's words. "Even kindness has a price," she whispered to the darkness. Up in his loft, George lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her words drifting up to him like smoke. He hated the gossip. He hated the town. But most of all, he hated the small, ugly part of himself that had listened. Morning arrived, grey and bleak. He found her outside, hanging sheets on a line. The air was so cold that frost was forming on the edges of the wet cloth. "You'll catch your death," he said, his voice rough. She didn't turn. "I'm used to the cold." They stood there in silence. From inside the cabin they could hear Annie singing to her doll. The sound, so innocent and pure, tightened a knot in George's chest. He wanted to apologize. He wanted to tell her he didn't believe the whispers, that she had brought nothing but life back into his home. But the words were frozen in his throat. All he could manage was, "Bread smells good." Her lips curved, but the smile never reached her eyes. "It'll be ready soon." She turned back to her work, and he watched her, a small, resilient figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape. And he had a terrible thought. What if the town was right? What if she really was bad luck? What if the warmth she'd brought was just the prelude to a fire that would burn them all down? That night, she served the last of the bread. She placed it on the table between them, a silent offering. "Eat," she said, her voice soft. He tore off a piece. The steam rose, carrying the scent of forgiveness. He looked up and met her eyes. There was a flicker of hope in them, a question she didn't dare ask. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. "For everything." Her small smile wavered. "Don't thank me yet," she said, and a chill that had nothing to do with the weather snaked down his spine. The snow began to fall again, soft and silent, burying the world. He watched her shadow move across the wall, and he felt the walls he'd built around his heart begin to crumble. He didn't know if she was his salvation or his ruin, and the terrifying part was, he wasn't sure he cared which. Days turned into weeks. The thaw began. The world outside the cabin started to wake up, and so did the world inside. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but filled with the comfortable rhythms of a shared life. Arian's humming was a constant presence, a soft melody woven into the fabric of their days. Annie's laughter, once a rare and fragile thing, now echoed off the wooden walls. She followed Arian everywhere, a tiny, devoted shadow. George found himself watching them, a strange ache in his chest. He watched Arian in the small garden she'd started, her hands gentle in the dark earth. He watched her telling Annie stories by the fire, her face animated in the flickering light. He was starting to feel things he hadn't felt since before his first wife, Ilara, had died. Things he'd sworn he would never feel again: hope, affection, fear. He was terrified of what would happen when the roads cleared and she decided to leave. But the thaw brought more than just crocuses. It brought the town back into their lives. On his next trip for supplies, Jonas Pike was waiting for him, leaning against the mercantile post with that same ugly grin. "Well, well, look who's back. Still keeping that cursed widow warm, George?" George ignored him, tying his horse to the rail. Pike wasn't deterred. He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial sneer in his tone. "You know, folks are starting to talk, wondering what really happened to your Ilara. A pretty young wife like that, just wasting away. And now you take in another one, a woman whose own husband wound up in the ground. It's a strange pattern, Whitlow." George's hand clenched into a fist. He turned, his eyes blazing. "You say one more word about my wife," he said, his voice dangerously low, "and I'll break your jaw." Pike held up his hands in mock surrender, but his eyes were gleaming with malice. "Just saying what everyone's thinking." The poison was spreading. It wasn't just about Arian anymore. It was about him. He rode home, with a storm brewing inside him. The accusations echoed in his head. What really happened to your Ilara? He burst into the cabin, the setting sun casting a long, ominous shadow behind him. Arian was at the stove, flour dusting her cheek. Annie was on the floor, carefully arranging pebbles into a circle. It was a picture of peace, and it felt like a lie. He couldn't hold it in. The words spilled out, harsh and ugly. "They're talking in town," he said, his voice tight. "About you, about me." Arian stilled, her back to him. "They always talk. They're saying, they're saying I have a pattern of women dying." She turned around slowly. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She searched his face, her gaze unwavering. "And what do you say, George?" He looked away, ashamed. He didn't have an answer. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. He expected her to cry, to yell, to defend herself. She did none of those things. She simply walked over to the small chest where she kept her few belongings. She pulled out a small, leather-bound book, a diary. She held it out to him. "This was your wife's," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I found it tucked under a loose floorboard in the loft." George stared at the diary as if it were a snake. Ilara's diary. He hadn't seen it since the day she died. He'd thought it was lost. "What's in it?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Arian's eyes held a deep, bottomless sorrow. "The truth," she said. "She wasn't sick, George. She was heartbroken. She was in love with someone else, someone from town. She was planning to leave you." Every word was a hammer blow. He stumbled back, shaking his head. No, it wasn't true. Ilara had loved him. She'd been frail, yes, but she had loved him. "Who?" he choked out. Arian's gaze flickered towards the door, towards the town. "She never wrote his name," she said softly. "She just called him J." A cold dread washed over George. J. Jonas Pike. The laughter, the sneers, the constant goading. It all made a sick kind of sense. Pike hadn't been spreading rumors. He'd been boasting. But before George could process this betrayal, Arian dropped another bomb. "There's more," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She didn't just die, George. The last entry. She wrote that she was going to tell you she was leaving. She was afraid. She wrote, 'If something happens to me, it was not an accident.'" George felt the floor drop out from under him. The town didn't just think Ilara had died under mysterious circumstances. They thought he'd killed her to stop her from leaving. And now Arian, the woman he'd let into his home, into his heart, was holding the proof. Or what looked like proof. He looked at her, standing there so calmly, holding his wife's diary, and a new, terrible suspicion took root. How had she found it? Had she been looking for it? Was this whole thing a setup? Was she working with Pike? "Why are you showing me this now?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of grief and rage. Her calm expression finally broke. Hurt flashed in her eyes. "Because I thought you deserved to know the truth. Because I was starting to care about you, and I didn't want to believe what they were saying." "Or maybe," he snarled, taking a step toward her, "you're showing me this because you want something. Money? The deed to this land?" "Stop it," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "That's not who I am." "How do I know who you are?" he shot back. "You're a stranger, a woman with a dead husband and a past you never talk about. For all I know, Aryan Grace isn't even your real name." He'd gone too far. He saw it in the way the light died in her eyes. She flinched as if he'd struck her. Without another word, she turned, grabbed her thin shawl from its peg, and walked out the door, leaving the diary on the table between them. She walked out into the cold twilight air, leaving him alone with the ghosts of both his wives. He stood there, his chest heaving, listening to her footsteps fade into the dusk. Little Annie, who had been watching the whole exchange with wide, frightened eyes, ran to him and clutched his leg. "You made her go away," she sobbed. "You were mean, just like with Mama." The child's words were a knife in his gut. He sank to his knees, pulling his daughter into his arms, the full weight of his disastrous life crashing down on him. He had driven away the only warmth he'd known in years, and in its place, he'd found a truth that was uglier than any lie the town could dream up. His wife had been planning to leave him for his enemy, and her last words accused him of murder. He picked up the diary, his hands trembling. He had to know. He had to read the words himself. He forced himself to read Ilara's elegant script, page after page, of a life he hadn't known she was living, a life of secret meetings, stolen moments, and desperate plans, a life that didn't include him or Annie. The final entry was just as Aryan had said. "I am telling him tonight. I cannot live this lie another day. Jay is waiting for me. God give me strength. If something happens to me, it was not an accident." He slammed the book shut. An accident. That's what it had been. They had argued. She had told him she was leaving. He had begged her to stay for Annie's sake. She had run from him, out into the yard where the ground was slick with early frost. She'd slipped near the old well, hit her head. He remembered the sickening crack, the way she lay so still. He'd panicked. He knew how it would look. He'd carried her back inside, told the doctor she'd fallen ill, that her weak heart had given out. He'd lied to protect his daughter from the scandal, from the truth that her mother hadn't loved them. He had buried his wife, and he had buried the truth along with her. But the truth hadn't stayed buried. And now Aryan was gone, walking straight back towards the town that hated her and the man who had ruined his life. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let her face Pike alone. He grabbed his coat and his rifle. "Stay inside, Annie," he commanded. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." He ran out into the gathering darkness, following the faint tracks she'd left in the muddy, thawing ground. The trail led straight towards town. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning in the cold air. The thought of Pike getting his hands on her, filling her head with more lies, made his blood run cold. He finally caught sight of her, a small, lonely figure on the path ahead. "Aryan," he shouted. She stopped but didn't turn around. He ran to catch up, grabbing her arm gently. "Don't go back there," he panted. "It's not safe." She finally turned to face him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes glowing in the moonlight. "And it's safe back there? With you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "A man who lied about his own wife's death." "I did it for my daughter," he said, his voice raw. "I did it to protect her." "Everyone has a reason for their lies, George," she said, pulling her arm free. "What's yours? Why did your husband really die?" The question hung between them, a mirror to his own suspicions. He looked into her eyes, searching for the truth, and saw his own fear and doubt reflected back at him. They were two fugitives running from their pasts, and they had just collided in the middle of nowhere. "He wasn't a good man," she said, her voice dropping so low he had to lean in to hear. "My husband, he had a temper, and hands like stones." The unspoken violence hung in the air. "One night he came home, drunk and angry about a card game. He came after me. I grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the hearth. I didn't mean to. I just wanted him to stop." She started to sob deep, ragged breaths. "I hit him. He fell. He just didn't get back up. The sheriff in that town, he was a friend of my husband's. He called it an accident, but he told me to run. He said his friends wouldn't see it that way, so I ran. I've been running ever since." George stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. Her caution, her fear of sudden movements, the way she carried herself like someone bracing for a blow. They were the same. Both trapped by a death they hadn't intended, both judged by a world that didn't know the truth. "My name isn't Grace," she whispered, looking at the ground. "It's Thorn, Arian Thorn." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently lifting her chin. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "None of it matters but this. Pike is the reason Ilara is dead. He filled her head with promises and then left her to face me alone. He's the one who should have paid the price, not me. Not you." Just then, they heard the sound of approaching horses, several of them. Fast, a group of riders appeared over the ridge, dark silhouettes against the moonlit sky. At the front was Jonas Pike, and beside him, wearing a dusty coat and a silver star on his chest, was a U.S. Marshal. Pike's voice rang out across the clearing, dripping with false concern. "There they are, Marshal. I told you we'd find them. That's George Whitlow, the man who murdered his wife. And that's the woman he's been holding captive, Arian Grace, or whatever her real name is." The Marshal, a tall, grim-faced man with eyes that had seen too much, dismounted slowly. His gaze swept over George, then lingered on Arian. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I have a warrant here," he said, his voice like gravel, "for the arrest of one Arian Thorn. Wanted for the murder of her husband, Samuel Thorn." Pike's face split into a triumphant grin. It was a perfect trap. George looked at Arian. Her face was ashen. This was it, the end of the line. The Marshal and his men were closing in, their rifles held ready. Pike was circling them like a vulture, savoring the moment. George knew he had a choice. He could let them take her. He could go back to his cabin, to his daughter, and try to forget any of this had ever happened. He could save himself, or he could stand his ground. He could fight for the woman who had brought his world back to life, even if it meant burning it all down. He looked at Arian's terrified face. He thought of her quiet humming, the smell of her bread, the way she held his daughter. He thought of the lies that had poisoned both their lives, and he made his choice. "Her name is Arian Whitlow," George said, his voice ringing with a clarity that surprised even himself. He stepped in front of her, shielding her with his body. "She's my wife." The Marshal stopped, his eyes narrowing. Pike let out a bark of laughter. "Your wife? You just met her, you fool. She's a murderess." "And you're a coward, Pike," George shot back, his eyes locked on his rival. "You whispered poison in my wife's ear until she didn't know which way was up. You promised her a new life, and then you let her die. Ilara's death is on your hands." "Lies," Pike sputtered, his face turning red. "He's trying to confuse you, Marshal." The Marshal looked from George to Pike, then back to Arian. He was a man who trusted his gut, and something about this situation smelled wrong. "Ma'am," he said to Arian, "is this true? Is this man your husband?" Arian looked at George, standing in front of her like a mountain, ready to face down a whole posse for her. A woman he barely knew. A woman with a dark past, and in that moment she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. She stepped out from behind him, her chin held high. "He is," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We were married by the circuit preacher last week." It was a lie, but it was a beautiful one. A lie that built a future instead of burying the past. Pike's face contorted with rage. "She's lying. Search the cabin. You won't find any marriage certificate." "That won't be necessary," said a new voice. An old man stepped out of the shadows of the trees. It was the circuit preacher, a man named Reverend Michael, who rode through these parts twice a year. He held a worn leather Bible in his hands. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Jonas," the preacher said, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "I performed the ceremony myself. It was a quiet affair. Just the three of them." He nodded towards George, Arian, and an imaginary Annie. George and Arian stared at him, stunned. The preacher had been nowhere near the valley. He was lying through his teeth to save them. Why? Pike was apoplectic. "You're lying, old man. You're in on it with them." The marshal held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at the preacher, a man known throughout the territory for his unwavering honesty. Then he looked at Pike, a man known for his venomous tongue. "Reverend," the marshal said slowly, "are you willing to swear on that Bible that you married this couple?" The preacher met his gaze without flinching. "I am." That was enough for the marshal, a man of God's word against a known troublemakers. He turned his cold eyes on Pike. "You've been yapping in my ear all the way from Deadwood, Pike, stirring up trouble, pointing fingers. Now I'm starting to think you had a reason to want Whitlow out of the way." The marshal's gaze then fell on Ilara's diary, which George was still clutching in his hand. "What's that book?" he asked. George held it out. "My first wife's diary. It tells a different story about how she died. A story that involves him." The marshal took the diary and began to read by the moonlight. The silence stretched on, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses. Pike's face had gone from red to a pasty white. He started to back away, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. "I didn't do anything," he stammered. "She was unstable. Crazy." The marshal looked up from the diary, his face like thunder. "It says here she was meeting a man she calls Jay. It says she was going to leave her husband for him. It says she was afraid." "That sounds a lot like you, Pike." Pike made a break for it. He spun around and scrambled for his horse, but George was faster. He tackled him, bringing him down into the mud. They rolled on the ground, a tangle of limbs and grunts and fists. The marshal's men pulled them apart. "It wasn't my fault," Pike screamed, his face covered in mud. "She slipped. It was an accident. I was there. I saw it happen." And just like that, the final lie unraveled. Pike had been there the night Ilara died. He hadn't just been the catalyst. He'd been a witness who had stayed silent, letting the blame fester and fall on George. The marshal hauled Pike to his feet. "You saw a woman fall and hit her head, and you did nothing. You let her husband believe she died of illness, and you let this whole town believe he was a killer. You're an accessory to this, Pike, at the very least." He shoved Pike towards his deputies. "Lock him up." As they dragged him away, Pike shot a look of pure hatred at George and Arian. "You'll regret this, both of you." The marshal turned back to Arian. He looked at her, then at the warrant in his hand. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of reason. "The warrant," he said, "is for Arian Thorne. As far as I can see, there's no one by that name here. Only an Arian Whitlow." He slowly tore the warrant in half, letting the pieces flutter to the muddy ground. "It seems my sources in your old town were misinformed about the circumstances of your husband's death. From what the preacher tells me, it sounds more like self-defense." He tipped his hat. "Mr. Whitlow, ma'am." He mounted his horse and rode off into the night, leaving George and Arian standing in the moonlight with the old preacher. They both turned to the man who had just saved them. "Why?" George asked, his voice choked with gratitude. "Why did you lie for us?" The preacher smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I spend my days listening to confessions, son. I know a true sin from a heavy burden. You two, you're carrying burdens. That man," he nodded in the direction Pike had been taken, "he's a sinner. The Lord's work is sometimes about balancing the scales." He clapped George on the shoulder. "Now I believe we have a wedding to make official." They walked back to the cabin, the three of them. When they opened the door, they found Annie asleep on the floor, her head resting on a pillow. The wooden doll clutched to her chest. A half-eaten piece of bread sat beside her. She had been waiting up. In the warm golden light of the cabin, with the fire crackling in the hearth, the preacher opened his Bible. He didn't have the proper rings or the fancy words of a church, but he had something more important. He had the truth. George and Arian stood before him, their hands clasped together. They weren't the same two people who had met in this cabin months ago. They were survivors. They had faced down their pasts and chosen a future. As they said their vows, their voices were quiet but firm, a promise made not just to each other, but to themselves. A promise to stop running. When it was over, George turned to Arian. He gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her face. "You saved me," he said. She gave him a small, watery smile. "No," she whispered back. "You saved me." Little Annie stirred in her sleep and murmured a single clear phrase. "She's kind, Daddy." And in that small cabin, surrounded by the vast, silent mountains, a new family was forged. Not in innocence, but in forgiveness. Not in perfection, but in the shared, messy, beautiful truth. Their life wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. They had fought the lies, they had faced the truth, and they had found a justice of their own making. A justice built on a foundation of warm bread, a crackling fire, and the simple, unwavering belief that everyone, no matter their past, deserves a second chance. The story of George and Arian Whitlow became a quiet legend in that valley. They never became rich, they never became famous. But they built a life, piece by piece. They had two more children, boys with George's dark hair and Arian's steady green eyes. Annie grew up to be a strong, kind woman, the laughter never again leaving her face. The cabin, once a place of loneliness and fear, became a home filled with warmth and the constant comforting smell of baking bread. Sometimes travelers passing through would stop at the Whitlow homestead, and they would be greeted with a warm meal and a place by the fire, no questions asked, and they would leave feeling a little less lost, a little less alone. Because that's what George and Arian did. They didn't just build a home for themselves, they built a sanctuary, a place that proved that even in the harshest wilderness, after the most brutal of storms, kindness could still take root and grow. If you enjoyed this story of survival, justice, and the power of finding home in the most unexpected places, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next story.